Why are you here, Mr. Clarkson?
Well, because I'm here to support farmers.
Right. Are you angry?
It's difficult to be angry on somebody else's behalf. That's like being... Yeah.
And he and his government are just tin-eared when it comes to British farmers, our agriculture, our food supply, our food security. And shame on them.
Jeremy Clarkson has publicly stepped in to defend farmers, turning what was a sector dispute into a national political confrontation and triggering a visible reaction from government leadership. When a figure with mass public reach aligns himself with rural protests, the issue stops being contained. It becomes unavoidable. That is why anger across farming regions now carries national weight, especially in a sector contributing $127 billion annually and supporting over 4 million jobs tied to food security and employment.
So one of the reasons Rachel Reeves says she brought this in is to stop wealthy people using it as a way.
No, that was the only reason she did.
Well, no, the other reason was to raise money for public services. Well, have you seen...
Are you listening to this?
Have you tried to get a GP appointment lately?
Yes.
Right.
I just recently had a heart attack.
Okay, so you know it's tough.
Yes.
Agricultural surveys show that more than 40% of family farms have been operating under sustained profit pressure even before the latest policy disputes intensified. Input costs have risen faster than output prices. Margins have thinned year after year. This context matters because it reframes the protests. They are not reactions to a single announcement. They are the release of long-contained strain inside an already weakened system. The demonstrations themselves reflect planning and coordination rather than spontaneous unrest. Thousands of farmers and tractor convoys have converged on London and surrounding corridors, disrupting traffic and forcing national attention. These movements require logistics, communication and collective intent. This is not an emotional flashpoint, it is organised resistance built on shared economic calculations and shared risk exposure across regions.
As I understand it, it was a very rushed last-minute decision. I think it's time for them to say, you know what, we've cocked this one up a bit and back down.
Into this environment stepped Jeremy Clarkson, and his involvement altered the trajectory. Clarkson publicly aligned with the protesting farmers and defended their claims using economic and operational arguments rather than party rhetoric. His framing focused on how farms function in practice, not how they appear on balance sheets. That distinction allowed the issue to move beyond partisan framing and into broader public comprehension. Clarkson's platform reaches far beyond rural Britain. His intervention translated complex agricultural policy into language accessible to urban and suburban audiences who rarely encounter farm economics directly. As a result, the dispute moved from specialist circles into mainstream political conversation. The protests stopped being framed as sector-specific grievances and began to be understood as a national policy conflict with implications for food supply and pricing. Central to Clarkson's defence is the inheritance tax dispute. He frames it not as a fiscal adjustment, but as a direct threat to family-owned farms. His argument rests on structure, not ideology. Farmland often holds high asset value while generating low liquid income. Taxing that value without regard to cash flow forces asset sales. In practice, that means land fragmentation or exit from farming altogether. Industry assessments indicate that an estimated 96% of farms fall within the scope of current inheritance tax structures once land and equipment values are fully considered. Farmers argue this reality contradicts official assurances that only a small subset would be affected. The discrepancy between technical exemptions and practical exposure has become a core point of contention, driving protest intensity. Agricultural organisations describe the measure as a body blow layered onto existing pressure. Fuel costs remain volatile. Fertiliser prices have surged. Feed and equipment expenses continue to rise. Against this backdrop, additional tax exposure is perceived as compounding risk rather than redistributing burden. The policy is not evaluated in isolation, but as part of a cumulative squeeze that narrows viability. Another fault line lies in perception of fairness. Farmers argue the policy penalises generational continuity while failing to distinguish between productive family farms and speculative or absentee land ownership. The distinction matters deeply within rural communities. Farms are not seen as investment vehicles, they are seen as working systems tied to food production and regional stability. Clarkson's defence consistently emphasises this point. Food production stability in his framing is being taxed in the name of revenue efficiency. The policy is interpreted not as reform but as misalignment between fiscal abstraction and operational reality. That message resonates because it reflects lived experience rather than theoretical modelling. The government response has shown visible strain. Clarkson's ability to bypass traditional political filters and speak directly to public sentiment creates discomfort inside institutional messaging structures. His commentary is not easily neutralised by press statements or technical clarifications. It moves through cultural channels that traditional political communication struggles to control. What has emerged is not a celebrity-led protest, but a credibility transfer. Clarkson acts as an amplifier, not a leader. The substance originates from farmers themselves. His role is to make that substance legible to a wider audience. The scale of response following his involvement indicates that the underlying grievance was already present and waiting for exposure. This first phase of the confrontation establishes the stakes clearly. A major economic sector under sustained pressure has moved into open protest. A high-profile figure has translated that pressure into national focus, and a specific policy has become the flashpoint through which deeper structural stress is now being contested in public view. The government's reaction has revealed strain rather than confidence, and that distinction is increasingly visible. Keir Starmer has publicly defended the inheritance tax policy as proportionate and targeted, yet parallel reporting points to growing unease within Labour's rural strategy. The gap between public certainty and internal concern has widened as protests gain scale. What is being defended in press statements is being recalculated behind closed doors, and that divergence has begun to show. Polling from rural constituencies reflects the pressure. Confidence in Labour's understanding of agricultural realities has declined across farming regions, not because of messaging tone, but because of perceived distance from operational life. Farmers report that explanations focus on thresholds and exemptions while ignoring cash flow, debt cycles and seasonal volatility. This mismatch has hardened scepticism and reduced the effectiveness of reassurance. Government messaging has evolved accordingly. Initial statements emphasised stability and fairness. Subsequent responses shifted toward firmer rebuttal and clarification. That progression signals rising institutional pressure. When reassurance gives way to correction, it suggests the narrative is slipping. The emphasis has moved from calming concern to disputing claims, an indicator that trust has already weakened. Treasury revenue projections tied to the policy have further complicated the picture. Independent analysts dispute the scale and certainty of projected gains, arguing that behavioural responses and asset restructuring could erode expected receipts. These critiques have circulated beyond specialist circles, weakening confidence in the fiscal rationale. When numbers become contested in public view, policy authority erodes alongside them. The tension now visible is not the posture of policy certainty, it resembles anxiety over narrative control and electoral consequence. Rural backlash is no longer hypothetical. It is measurable in turnout, media attention and shifting sentiment. The response pattern suggests a government attempting to stabilise perception while recalibrating strategy under pressure. Media coverage has played a decisive role in shaping how this conflict is understood. Independent media analysis shows that farmer protests receive less sustained broadcast coverage than urban demonstrations of comparable scale. The discrepancy is not absolute absence, but duration and framing. Coverage appears episodic rather than continuous, emphasising disruption over substance. On social platforms, the pattern diverges sharply. Engagement spikes around content associated with Clarkson and farmer-led messaging, while official government explanations attract weaker traction. The asymmetry reflects differences in narrative clarity. Messages grounded in lived experience travel further than technical defences. Visibility follows resonance rather than authority. Farmers and advocacy groups argue that rural voices are consistently filtered through political spokespeople instead of being presented directly. Press conferences feature officials interpreting rural concerns rather than farmers articulating them. This mediation alters tone and substance, reinforcing perceptions that rural communities are spoken about rather than listened to. The result is a sense of managed visibility. Debate appears curated rather than open. When coverage prioritises institutional response over sector testimony, distrust deepens. The imbalance does not silence dissent entirely. It reshapes how dissent is perceived, often as disruption rather than dialogue. This dynamic feeds back into protest behaviour. When groups believe their concerns are selectively represented, escalation becomes a tool for visibility. The persistence of demonstrations reflects not just policy disagreement, but frustration with communicative access. Media structure becomes part of the conflict. Rather than a neutral observer, beyond media and messaging, the stakes extend into broader economic stability. Agricultural economists emphasise that food supply resilience depends on continuity of production, not short-term fiscal gains. Farms operate on long horizons. Disrupting generational transfer and investment planning introduces risks that compound over time. Analysts warn that sustained pressure on farmers could drive long-term contraction in domestic food production. Reduced output increases reliance on imports, exposing supply chains to global volatility. This is not an abstract concern. Import dependence shifts pricing power, availability, and resilience away from domestic control. Consumer advocates connect these dynamics directly to grocery price stability and shelf availability. When domestic production weakens, downstream effects reach consumers quickly. Price volatility increases, availability becomes less predictable. The consequences are distributed across the population, not confined to rural regions. Economists frame protest behaviour within this context as rational under uncertainty. When livelihoods face structural threat, collective action becomes a protective response. The protests are not framed as emotional excess, but as calculated defence of future viability. That framing challenges narratives that dismiss unrest as reactionary. What emerges from these intersecting pressures is a widening gap between central policy design and ground-level economic reality. The inheritance tax dispute has become a focal point because it concentrates multiple tensions into a single issue. Fiscal abstraction collides with operational constraint. Messaging collides with experience. The broader conflict is not defined by a single tax mechanism. It is defined by alignment. When policy outcomes diverge from sector realities, resistance escalates. When communication prioritises control over comprehension, trust declines. The current moment reflects both dynamics unfolding simultaneously. As this phase develops, the response of institutions will shape its trajectory. Adjustments that acknowledge operational realities may stabilise relations. Continued emphasis on narrative management risks deepening confrontation. The outcome will depend less on rhetorical defence and more on whether policy recalibration restores confidence where it has been lost.